you know what? I never started the recording. How useful you find the information is probably going to determine how easily you find it to remember something, right? You dig back into your past, chances are you don't quite remember, although I don't remember, maybe you guys do because you're kind of closer to it. You may not remember the formula for calculating the derivative of an equation, right? I don't, because you may not use it, you may not find it very interesting. However, if you ask me to recall the one time I was really embarrassed in music class in elementary school, I can give you a crystal clear recreation of that experience. So some things were more important to me, and that's going to affect whether I can remember them. Okay, good. Any other aspects of memory that kind of stand out to you?
Uh, I guess we kind of already covered with the other, but reward, which I guess that's kind of what we were talking about already, motivation.
That
Um,
is tied to motivation. Yeah. If you're rewarded for something, chances are, I mean, you have an incentive to remember it, right? If you are rewarded for making the if you're rewarded for making a number of jump shots in a basketball game and getting a score for your team, and then you win, you're probably going to have an easier time remembering how to do that in the future. Yeah.
I guess also remembering not to do something, like messing up to keep your body going and moving and for productivity, efficiency.
Good. So I like this crossover between what we learned in operant conditioning and this, right? Is you can remember to do something through its effect on it rewarded you, or because it punished you, you suffered because of it, right? All right, so we build those connections first. But anyone who has ever tried to remember something, you probably know that building a connection in the first place is not the only step. And in fact, it may not be the most important step. For example, you might look at this image and go, ah, I remember learning what that thing is. I remember it had a name, and I remember that he used it in a couple of lectures already, but I can't remember the words. What was it? A something badger, a honey something? Another part of memory is going to be your ability to bring that memory back into your conscious awareness. So that is when you're actively thinking about something, right? When I ask you to remember what a spoon is, right? You can actually visualize in your mind physically what a spoon looks like, the number of times you've used a spoon, you've used it for soup, you've used it for, fishing apples out of a I don't know, tank or something. You can actually visualize that. You can bring those images, that memory of your using a spoon into your conscious awareness. And that's an important part of memory too. It's not just that you've recorded the information, you have to bring it back. If you've ever taken an exam and you remember studying for something and you know it's in there, but you can't quite get it back out, that's a problem with recall. That's a problem with bringing it back into your subjective, your conscious awareness. So just because you record it does not mean you can access it. And that's a distinction we're going to make when we talk about, there's a lecture this week on long-term memory. We're going to talk about that aspect of long-term memory. That tends to be the thing that people struggle with the most. People know how to record, how to get information into their brains. Usually, we're pretty good about that. The hard part is actually bringing it back, and that's an entirely separate skill and one that I don't think is appreciated enough. All right. Those are some aspects of memories. So, William, you've already started to do this, but I want to kind of sink our teeth into this a little bit more. Can we explain what a memory might be using this terminology that we've been using? And I want to dig really deep here. I want to talk way back about cognitive biases. Remember, which are the tendency to behave or think in a certain way. I want to talk about heuristics. That is those mental shortcuts, those simple, easy solutions to problems, such as, if you go on a date and you find out that that person is genetically related to you, they're close family, that instinctual kind of automatic response of, oh, no, I can't kiss you anymore, this date is over. Things like that, heuristics, these automatic responses. I want to talk about long-term potentiation. I want to talk about the processes of associative learning. So can we use these things that we've learned about to understand what a memory is? So how would you define a memory given the terms that we have at our disposal now?
I guess
Sorry, William. Take some time to think about this. Absolutely, go ahead and talk. But everyone, I challenge. This is a really difficult question. There's a lot of parts to it. So actually, take a moment to really think deeply. Try to connect this information in your mind for yourself. Yeah, go ahead, William.
I was gonna say, based off this, it all looks like there's stuff with the opinions, and like we were talking about the neurons before. Um, it all seems like memory is based off of what you feel is important to you, and also putting in like bias. It's like that's unique to everyone, I feel like.
Okay, true. So if memory, like you said before, if memory is you're building up these connections between neurons, and so as you build them up, they become stronger, that you can they activate, those connections activate more reliably, then some of how strong those connections are going to be is going to depend on your personal experiences, the things that you find personally rewarding. I agree with that, yes. Mm-hmm. So we have these connections between neurons, and how do we build these connections? So when we learn something, physically, what is changing when you say you build a connection, you make a connection stronger?
Your neurons.
Right. What part of the neuron, and how does that change happen?
Oh, the axon terminal, and that's where that's where the strength. Oh, I remember the term. It was Oh, that was just long-term potentiation.
That is long-term potentiation. Yes. So this connection is becoming stronger. That's what's illustrated right here. We have a connection between two neurons. This neuron is carrying an electrical charge. It's trying to communicate it to the next neuron in line. And so it sends the electrical charge down. These little neurotransmitters get released. So the more that you stimulate this connection, such as by repeatedly pairing, say, a metronome or a bell with food, the more that you pair these two things together, the stronger the connection becomes between the ringing of a bell and presenting food. Such that eventually, if you re-stimulate this connection over and over and over again long enough, the connection becomes stronger by virtue of there being more neurotransmitters and more receptors to receive those neurotransmitters. So you start to build a connection between a bell or a metronome and food, such that you can just ring a bell or just tick that metronome and a dog starts to salivate. This is the basis of what we've been learning. Now I want to tie it back to what we learned before. Can anyone think of one of the cognitive biases that we learned about way back at the beginning of this class?
I remember one that stood out to me was the authority bias, and that was
Good.
where you tend to follow authority more.
Okay, good. So let's assume that authority bias is a shortcut, right? If in a situation you don't know something, we just rely on authority because presumably authority knows better. They might be older, they might be more experienced, they're an expert. For some reason, they're an authority, right? How might you build up this cognitive bias using long-term potentiation and associative learning? How might you learn the authority bias?
Your parents.
How so? So run me through the process by which, imagine I'm a newborn babe or whatnot. I'm new to this world, and now I'm learning things. I'm interacting with the world. How would I potentially learn an authority bias?
Um, well, I keep thinking. I guess whatever you believe would be important to you. Like if your parents do something, like they feed you and then they teach you how to feed yourself, you would start to be able to feed yourself. But same thing with clothing yourself, and same thing with, I guess, walking even.
Okay, good. Let's imagine you are an entirely new child. You don't know how to feed yourself. So your belly starts to grumble. That's physiologically, that's just going to happen, right? You get hungry, you start to cry because you're really hungry and you want food. What ends up happening is your parents then come up to you and say, here, put this in your mouth. Take this spoonful of applesauce, or take this spoonful of baby food, and then you won't be hungry anymore. What you start through that so you eat that food, you're no longer hungry. It happens again, they feed you food, you're no longer hungry. What you're eventually going to start to learn, what you're going to start to associate, is that when you listen to your parents, when you do what they recommend that you do, it tends to be good, right? So in the future, when your parents ask you to do something, when they say, I think you should do this, you're going to look back on all those experiences of them having done something for you and then it having worked out. And therefore, you're going to be more likely to listen to them in the future. You're going to build a bias to listen to them as an authority. How else can we apply this? In what other situation might you have built a bias to listen to authority? In what other situations might you have just kind of learned, hey, authority's right, or authority works, or it's a sure bet. It's a pretty good bet to listen to authority. Might you have seen that learning process elsewhere?
Uh, well, cognitive bias, isn't that also like uh, a different type of bias too? Uh, that like hmm, it was like for rationality and good judgment.
Yes. So a part of this definition, so the cognitive bias is kind of it's an umbrella term. It's a category into which authority bias belongs. So there are many different kinds of cognitive bias. And yes, the other part of this definition is sometimes having these connections, learning these biases can actually lead to the wrong decision, right? So for example, if you build up over time, your parents are a reliable source of information, and then they happen to give you some wisdom, or they teach you something that actually isn't helpful, right? So maybe they teach you, I don't know, they teach you that the world's flat. They are really convinced that the world's flat, right? And so you say, oh, they're the authority, they must be right. Then you start to realize, well, that's not quite right. So that can lead to just relying on an authority could actually lead you further away from what is true. But that is another part of it, yes.
That I just remembered like confirmation bias, which is basically what you just described. You're, because of your parents saying that the earth is flat, you want to find other people that say the earth is flat so you can agree with them and like prove your case.
Yeah, very similar. There's actually a slight difference there. So it's not so much that you believe it because your parents believe it. That would be authority bias. Confirmation bias would be you seek out information because it already confirms what you believe currently. So if you already believe something, Your bias will be to find other people who also believe it. And yeah, there are several potential explanations for why confirmation bias exists, but one of the ones that I'm most convinced by is if you find other people who believe the same thing you do, then what you can do is you can form strong groups where you collectively push your beliefs on other people, and that can actually be a very it's actually a very adaptive thing to do. Is to kind of create groups and then force your beliefs on others. It sounds coercive, but it's served humans for a very long time. We do all kinds of things that way. Okay. If this is sending you for a loop, that's fine. Because this is I hope you found I talk about this every week because this is kind of I like to think of this as kind of the meta narrative of the class. This is kind of the overarching theme that I want to carry through that by the end I hope is going to click if it hasn't clicked already. But these are the kinds of things that I challenge you to do when you're studying for exams, when you're studying this content in general, is try to figure out how it all connects, because it does. When we create connections, we're building those connections through long-term potentiation. And the way that long-term potentiation happens is through this process of associative learning. We're building connections through these learning processes. And through learning certain things, we actually build these cognitive biases. We build these heuristics. We build these kind of mental shortcuts. If you are rewarded for listening to authority, then you will have a bias to listen to authority in the future. Just as much as a dog, if a dog learns that bell means food is going to come, you're going to start to depend on, you're going to assume that when you hear a bell, food is going to come. All right. This is the basis of memory. So we're building up connections, and then we're doing something with these connections. All right. Here's a concept I want to introduce you to that I think is going to be very helpful for navigating the memory chapter. When you build a memory is at its most basic level just that connection that you build between neurons. So when you remember something, what you're doing is you are reactivating a connection. Let's go back to my example of the honey badger. You have a connection in your brain that is responsible for connecting the words honey badger with the visual image of that animal, its color, the number of nails it has on its claws, what it's capable of doing to a beehive. You have that connection within your brain. So when you remember something, what you're doing is you're actually re-stimulating that connection. When you re-stimulate that connection, you then have that memory. You have it in your kind of conscious awareness. You think about it, right? As much as if you're playing a sport and you have to hit a baseball with a bat, right? There is a collection of neurons that is responsible for your memory of how your arms need to be and in what direction you need to swing that bat for that bat to end up hitting the ball. So when you go to hit a baseball with a bat, you are stimulating the neurons that are associated with knowing how to swing a bat. That is what memory is. You're re-stimulating those connections. Now, the secret about memory is usually it's never the case that a memory that you have is only going to be coded within one connection. More often, memories are created when you stimulate a network of neurons. A network of neurons. All right, so what's a network? I think you all understand what a network is. If you're just saying, oh, it's a network, I know what that is. But how would you define a network? What makes something a network?
I guess the several neurons that have become connected or have had a strong connection through long-term potentiation. Also, wouldn't you be able to I guess, find a way to cut certain strands to like um, forget memories in a good way.
Abs- Absolutely, and in a bad way. Yes. So first of all, if we're talking about a network, yes, we're talking about many different connections, and so it's going to be in the context of neurons, many different connections built between different neurons. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a network. And yes, you're right. If what I'm saying is true, then what we could do is if you physically destroy that connection, you will physically destroy memory. And that is what happens. Anyone who has ever had a concussion or anyone who has ever had damage to the brain, you have probably forgotten things for a little while. For example, if any of you have ever had a concussion where you had damage to the back of the brain near the cerebellum where you have that motor memory stored, what can happen is a concussion is when your brain, based on if you have a very sudden movement of your head. I mean, you need you can't do this just by moving your head around, but a very sudden movement of your head such that the brain shifts inside of your skull and then crushes against the side of the skull. And what that does is it will damage, depending on where it crushed, it will damage a certain part of the brain, usually just temporarily. A concussion, usually you'll come back from. Now, if you have many concussions, that could be a different problem. But if you get a concussion right back here on the cerebellum, where all your motor memory is stored, you might realize you get that concussion, and then for a moment, you might not be able to move. You might be kind of temporarily paralyzed, or in kind of a less extreme case, you might have a really hard time walking or something like that. So maybe you can get up, you can kind of stand up, but you feel really dizzy that you kind of fall over. Your legs don't quite want to move how you intend for them to move. What you're doing is, for just a moment, the network of neurons, the connections that are responsible for your memory of knowing how to walk have been crushed, have been damaged, and you no longer have that memory, at least for a little while. Time goes on, you might go through physical therapy. You might just need to relax and let your neurons kind of heal themselves a little bit. As the neurons heal, or as you go through physical therapy, which is why you have physical therapy, you're slowly rebuilding those connections, and then you can walk again. You can remember how to walk again. So yes, if you destroy certain parts of the brain, if you destroy certain connections, you will lose the memories associated with those connections. Does anyone have an
Got
experience of like that where you've had an injury and it was really hard to do something?
I I personally haven't, but I had a friend that growing up was extremely good at playing piano, and then one day on a baseball field, one of her teammates got angry and actually hit her in the back of the head with a baseball bat. And after recovering and stuff, she couldn't play the piano anymore and still can't to this
Oh
day.
wow. Oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah, piano's motor movement. That's going to be stored. That's going to be stored in the back there. So if they get hit in the back of the head, that makes sense. Oh, that's unfortunate. Wow.
It's crazy because I was like, man, if somebody like took away like something like that for me, that would be horrible. But I do have a friend that suffered that.
Yeah. Oof. You know, I think I may have mentioned this when in the biology chapter, a guy named Phineas Gage. There's actually an example of a railroad worker who, so back in the day, they used to use dynamite a lot with railroad work because you'd have to clear paths, you'd have to, break apart stone and stuff. And there was actually an example of a railroad worker who some explosives went off, and part of the railroad piece of metal shot up and actually went right through the front of the guy's skull. And so they lived, funnily enough. However, it actually destroyed a bunch of the neural connections up near the front of the brain. And if you remember, that's the frontal lobe. That's the part that's responsible for your personality, for your decision making, stuff like that. After that was destroyed, after he had lost those connections, he actually started acting very, very differently. His personality had changed substantially. According to reports of kind of, because he was referred to clinical to a clinic, obviously, that needed help after that. But his coworkers and all that really, noted that he used to be very responsible, came to work on time, was very amiable, very, very friendly. And then after this accident, he ended up being a lot more, he got angry a lot. He had no patience. He wouldn't come to work on time. He actually started to develop substance abuse. He started drinking a lot and relying on alcohol. And so, I think you really have to appreciate that a lot of what you are capable of doing, a lot of who you are even, is going to be dependent on these connections that are built within your brain. If those get destroyed, things change.
That's pretty crazy. And especially since like you hear something like that and the rest of like everything they do as far as like what they do throughout the day doesn't change. Like they can be normal. It's just it's like they've had something taken away from them just from like a baseball bat or a dynamite explosion.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Is that your abilities, the things that you remember, are going to be localized to a certain part of the brain. So the motor movements back here, personalities up here. You're going to have, hearing and some other functions, and the temporal lobes, and kind of your sensory and motor cortex, your ability to move and sense things, are kind of up in here. So if you damage those particular areas, you start to lose those particular abilities. Yeah. So I want to go back to this concept of a network, because at the most basic level, yes, it just means a bunch of connections between stuff. But I want to look at other types of networks to really emphasize why it's important to think of memory as being created from a network. Think about how the internet works. The internet is really it's like the quintessential network. It's literally the internet, the internetwork, right? The way that the internet is laid out is, it's not like, so the internet is a network in that in every instance, how the internet is created is you have a bunch of independent individuals who are all kind of buying into or connecting into the network. So that is, when I'm on my computer, I am voluntarily connecting with Facebook, with Twitter, with these websites that are also independent. They're their own thing. And then other people from other parts of Walterboro, from other parts of the United States, from other parts of the world, are also independently connecting into that website. So it's a network, and that you have a bunch of individuals who are all kind of connecting themselves to this larger framework, this larger network. Okay? And that's important. The focus really should be on you should really think about, when you think about a network, think that individuals are connecting to that network. In terms of neurons, in terms of the brain, or an individual, the equivalent of an individual would be an individual neuron. We have individual neurons connecting into that network. And if, say, the internet goes out, when the internet goes out, it's not that the entire internet goes out, right? It's that it might be your internet goes out, or maybe a website goes down. But just because a website's down doesn't mean all the other websites are down. Or just because your internet's off doesn't mean that all the internet, everyone's internet is off. So when this network fails, it fails because a part of it goes offline. A part of it doesn't work. But that doesn't mean the whole thing doesn't work. The same logic applies to how the university is set up, how the University of South Carolina is set up. USC Salkehatchie is part of a network of colleges, and that network is called Palmetto College. It's the connection between USC Salkehatchie, USC Sumter, USC Union, USC, what am I forgetting, Lancaster. It's part of and Columbia as well. It's all part of a network. Now, the advantage of that is we are individuals who are kind of buying into this network. We're all connecting into it. And if something happens in USC Union, it doesn't really affect anyone in USC Salkehatchie. And so what can happen is if, let's say, one branch of the university for some reason isn't working well, or it's something happens to them, there would be other parts of the university that could step in to help, them. So if USC Union, for some reason, they had a catastrophe, a tornado came through, or a hurricane came in and just absolutely decimated the town. In the short term, what could happen is the other colleges step up, the other parts of the university step up, and they help Union overcome that disaster. Maybe we start helping to educate some of their students, that credits transfer, the students transfer, etc., at least to help out. That is also true of how memory networks work, is that when you build many different connections, if one part of that network fails, you still have other parts of the network as backup to help out. That's also how friend groups work. Your friend group is a network of people. You are friends with someone who is also friends with someone else, who's also friends with someone else, and maybe you don't hang out with them on a daily basis, but by virtue of you being friends with a network of people, if something really bad happened to you, if, say, you had something traumatic happen to your family, what ends up happening is usually, if you're in a well-connected community, a well-connected group of friends, those people who you don't see very often but who are part of the network usually come out of the woodwork to help you out, right? They kind of come out and they say, oh, we don't hang out very much, but I am connected to you, and they might come over and kind of spend time with you, or send you gifts, or send you money, donate to help you out, things like that. That is the benefit of a network. You have many, many different connections, so that if one part of the network fails, you have some backup connections to help you out. Okay. I hope this sets the stage. I hope you're starting to see where I'm going with this. When you build memories for something, the ideal thing that you should do is not just rely on building. When you're trying to remember something, don't just rely on one connection. You want to rely on many, many different connections to remember what you're trying to remember. So at the basis of this, your experience of a memory will be when you activate the network of neurons that are responsible for that memory. To again show you this concept, I want you to imagine a toaster, just to show you how different parts you can separately activate different parts of a network, of a memory network. Imagine a toaster. All right, just literally just imagine a toaster in your mind right now. What does it look like? What are its features? All right, just holistically try to imagine every part of a toaster that you can. What you're doing is, and that right now you are activating the neural connections, the neurons that are responsible for your memory of a toaster and every aspect of it. Its color, what it looks like, what it sounds like when you're using it, how it warms up, the fact that you had to plug it in, et cetera, et cetera. Then what you can do is I can ask you to imagine, to just think about the press handle. Really clearly think that maybe the toaster that's in your house, what does that press handle look like? The thing that you push down to actually make the toaster work. Some of you may have a really, really clear memory of that. Oh yeah, it has two little grooves in it for my two little fingers, so that when I press down, it makes it really easy to do. It's colored black, or it makes this really screechy noise when I press it down because the toaster's so old. Some of you might not have a clear memory of that. You just kind of remember that you have a toaster, but you don't really remember the individual features of it. When you think of the press handle, you are stimulating a portion of the network that is responsible for your memory of a toaster. It's still activating generally your memory of a toaster, but now you're kind of stimulating a very particular subset of neurons that is responsible for your memory of the press handle. Or if you think about the color of the heating elements, you probably have a very vivid memory of what the heating elements of a toaster look like. Probably because your parents very early on said, hey, when this thing is on, do not put anything inside of it. Even when it's not on, if it's plugged in, don't put a fork inside, don't put your fingers inside. And then you're like, well, why? And you actually use a toaster, you realize this thing lights up bright reddish orange. It gets hot. It looks scary. You don't want to touch that. And so a lot of people have a very clear, vivid memory of the heating elements of a toaster because that's really important information to you. That's a separate part of that network to remember those heating elements and what they look like. You might also remember where it's located, right? Within your kitchen. So what we can do is if you're stimulating this toaster memory, you can then start to stimulate a much larger connection, a larger network, and that is the memory network that is in charge of, is responsible for your memory of your kitchen, right? So now you're not just remembering your toaster, you're remembering your toaster as a part of your kitchen. You realize that it's kind of in the corner, it's on top of the counter, next to the sink. Maybe you've got some frying pans hanging up above it. And so you can take that network and then think about and then activate the connections that are connected to that toaster network. Every time you do that, you're stimulating a different part, a different network responsible for a different memory related to whatever you're trying to think about. Yeah, William.
I was gonna say I know that there's a lot of people that actually I don't know if you would consider a condition, but they can't picture things in their head. I guess that's like picture. I can clearly like imagine a toaster. I don't even have a toaster that you're talking about. I have one that's connected to the microwave. But I can still picture like exactly what it is. But there's some people that just can't do that.
Yeah. There is I forget exactly what that neurological condition is called, but you're right, where it's very difficult to visualize something in your head. There's actually fun fact, just as a normal ability, what you find. So I teach a class on sexuality. So one of the differences I talk about are sex and gender differences in psychological abilities and things like that. What we find is that both men and women are absolutely capable of generating three-dimensional objects and to rotate them in their mind. But what you find is that without practice, men actually tend to be a bit better at rotating three-dimensional objects in kind of their mind's eye, right? When you imagine something and then you imagine, okay, imagine your toaster. Now rotate it 180 degrees, rotate it around. Men actually tend to perform better on those tasks when they don't have practice. If both men and women are allowed to practice and they practice plenty, then they tend to score the same. But yeah, there seems to be kind of a, by default, men kind of have that advantage. There are plenty of advantages that women tend to have too. For example, reading emotional cues from people's faces. Women tend to be much better at kind of tuning into those cues. Yeah.
Yeah,
I forget what that
I can only
neurology.
imagine. Yeah, unless it's like something that I remember is specifically two-dimensional, like it's impossible for me not to think of it in 3D. Like I can imagine it being like a blueprint almost of like what specific parts of a toaster make up a toaster. But it is strange.
Yeah, and that it is funny that you can kind of like, even if you don't have your own toaster that looks like what I was just describing, you may have seen one somewhere, and so you can kind of imagine what a toaster looks like because you have a memory of each part of a toaster, and so you can kind of string them together. You can kind of fabricate this imaginary or this fake toaster from the memories that you have stored of seeing toasters elsewhere. Maybe you saw them in cartoons, you saw them in other people's households, you saw them at the store, and so you can kind of piece together those bits of memories into an entirely imaginary one. That tends to be what we do, and when children play imagination, what they do is they take things that they remember, they've seen, and then they kind of recreate them in their mind, and they impose them in the world around them. I used to, when I was a little kid, I had this alleyway behind my parents' house where my friends, I mean, there was nothing there. It was like an empty, just like stone road, and there was a tree there, and there was like my parents' garage and stuff like that. But you could go out there and you could imagine, say, I mean, one of the things that we'd do is we'd like pretend it was, like a covert military operation where you're just like sneaking around and you're like pretending to like, sneak into someone's base and like, steal plans to do something. Clearly none of that was there, but we had the memory of these things. We'd seen them in shows, we could imagine them. And so we kind of imposed that on this kind of empty, open alleyway. What you're doing is you're activating your memories of these things and you're kind of putting them together in a new way that you hadn't before. That is what imagination is.
You just like completely made me remember. I like associate everything with color, and so when I was in kindergarten, I didn't learn the names of the days of the week. But at first I memorized just straight the color, and so I didn't think of the day being like Monday. I thought the day being blue, and Tuesday was pink, Wednesday was green, etc.
Right. Yeah. 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 Uh-huh. Yeah. So yeah, it's funny how like, especially when you're younger, I think it's easier to remember these kind of like these more like concrete, like if you could see it in front of you, you can see the color blue, but you can't. It's kind of hard to see the day Monday. So you like think about in these really concrete terms sometimes. I think it's easier for a lot of people, especially when you're younger.
Yeah, I still do it though for some reason because of that, but it's weird.
So my point here is that if you stimulate different networks, you produce different memories. If you stimulate the part of the memory network responsible for the press handle versus the heating element versus where it's located, you're stimulating a different collection of neurons that are all part of that larger network of toaster. All right, so given what I've presented to you so far, is there any way that you could use this information to help you study in college, in school, to learn anything? Does this information help you understand what it means to build a memory of something?
I mean, for me, it would be. It's weird because I don't study with color, but I do study just from recalling and like. Actually, your one of your tests had a good example where it was when you're studying with flashcards and you mess up on one, you start the whole thing back over for punishment.
Okay, true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's kind of a good way to combine the operant conditioning and memory. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, if you kind of if you can kind of shape the incentives. You can shape how incentivized you are to learn something, right? So if you impose this rule on yourself that every time you get something wrong, you're going to have to start over at the very beginning, you're going to motivate yourself. That's going to motivate you to make sure that you get it right, right? To avoid that punishment. Yeah, yeah, yeah. True. That's a good example. Given that memories tend to be created by a bunch of different connections, one of the things that you can rely on is that if you want to remember something, the best thing you can do is not just practice that one thing over and over and over again, but rather build up a network of connections, build up a larger memory network around that thing you're trying to learn. So for example, when you were trying to learn the days of the week as a child, what you could have done is just sat there and thought over and over again, okay, this day of the week is called Monday. this day of the week is called Tuesday, and just repeat that self over and over. Repeat that to yourself over and over again. And I imagine what your hope was. If you repeat that over and over again, eventually you'll actually remember the word Monday. You'll remember the word Tuesday, and all the letters that are associated with it. But one of the things you can do is, rather than just learn the word, you could also try to add a color in there, where you remember Monday as blue, you remember Tuesday as yellow, you remember Wednesday as green. For some reason, those are actually the colors that come to mind when I think of those things. You associate a color. So now what you've done is you have a memory network for the days of the week that not only rely on the actual word, but that also rely on the color. Does anyone see a strength of doing this? In terms of remembering what something is, that is actually bringing it back, recalling it, not just storing it, but bringing it back and using it. Any advantage to doing that, where you have multiple connections, building that memory?
There's a huge advantage, in my opinion, because you also just reminded me that I'm learning Spanish, and so I memorize the days of the week in Spanish using the same exact colors as I did when I was in kindergarten. So it also makes connections to learn other things as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It can be really hard to learn a second language, especially after you've kind of hit that. After you've left adolescence, it gets or after you've left childhood, really, and you've entered adolescence, it's really hard to learn a new language. So yeah, you can, by creating that network where you associate it with colors, what you can do is, if that's a really solid memory, what you can do is you can connect that memory with this new memory that you're trying to build for the days of the week in Spanish. That helps. Yes, absolutely. We'll actually talk about what that's called. There's a particular technique that's called, and that we'll get to in this coming week. Does anyone see any other advantage to building a large, expansive network of memories to remember something, or to build multiple connections to remember the one thing? So knowing that Monday is not only associated with the word Monday, but also that it's blue.
Because I also, like I said, I guess I associate it with other things too, like organization methods and the months of the year as well, and other images for recall, like the honey badger. I use the color and the way its face looks to remember what a honey badger is.
Yeah,
Really,
yeah,
just
good.
for recall, just for recall in general.
Right, right. There's a very particular truth about memory that I think once you realize it, it can revolutionize how you study and how you try to remember things. Remember when on this slide, I made the argument that one of the advantages of a network is that if one part of that network fails, you have backup connections. When you build memories by creating many, many different connections, what happens is, if one of those connections fails, you then have backup connections to help you along, to help you to kind of stimulate. Wait, what am I forgetting here? So let me give you an example. Let's say that I was quizzed. Let's say I quizzed you on the days of the week. All right. And you had to remember, just straight up recall, like there's a blank space and you have to write in the word Monday. But you can't remember the word Monday. There's a connection in your brain that associates the letters M-O-N-D-A-Y. Those letters together are connected to the idea of Monday, right? And you just can't remember what those letters are. That connection failed you. If you had no other ways of remembering Monday, you just wouldn't be able to remember it, right? It would you'd fail to remember Monday. However, if you associate it with a color, blue, then in that moment you can say, ah, shit, I can't remember what the word is. However, I remember I also connected that day with the color blue. And so you think about that experience of, oh, it was blue. What day was blue? And then that helps you remember the word Monday. So rather than actually knowing what the word Monday is, instead you kind of get there indirectly by first remembering that it was blue, and then remembering that it was blue kind of inspires you and go, oh yeah, it was Monday, it was Monday. Let me try to think of another example of this. If you are, oh, when I taught you the definition of psychology, I not only gave you the definition, I told you that it has 3 parts. And those 3 parts are really important. So you have a couple of memories there. One, you have the memory of what the definition is. You know that there are words that if you string them together, it creates the definition of psychology. Let's say you don't remember that definition. For some, you're not really into psychology. You don't really like the definition. You don't really care that much. And so you're trying to remember it, but you're just failing to remember it. So what you do is you think about the other connection you have. The connection is, okay, I know that there are 3 parts. Once you start thinking, there are 3 parts, you can then start to piece together the definition by trying to remember each individual part. So maybe you remember, okay, well, it's the definition of psychology. So I remember there are 3 parts. I remember one of those parts was, it's a study of mental processes, because it's the brain, right? You're studying thinking. Okay, that's one part. Well, it wasn't just thinking, it was also how we act. Oh, it's behavior too. Okay, there's behavior and there's mental processes. What's that 3rd part though? It must have been really important. And what that does is as you think about the different, as you activate these other memories, you might accidentally then kind of stimulate that 3rd part, and that you start thinking, there's a 3rd part. I remember he said it was really important. What really sets psychology apart from any other study of thinking and behavior? Oh yeah, it uses the scientific method. Oh, it's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. What you're doing is you're using these backup connections that you have, knowing that there are 3 parts to the definition, to slowly, perhaps more slowly than otherwise, but slowly rebuild the bigger definition that you have. You can do the same thing with learning Spanish. For example, with word conjugations, what you can do is, let's say that you learn how to conjugate into the I form, the you form, the he, she, the they, the we, all that. And you can kind of remember, maybe as you're remembering these things, you might remember them in kind of this, anyone who's taken a foreign language, you might actually organize it as like, yo, tu, el, ella, and there's kind of one up here, it's nosotros, which is we, and then there's something over here, and then there's, ellos, they, all that. And so if you remember, what can happen is you might remember what the I form or what the you form is based on its position in that chart that you made. This is the advantage of making charts, of drawing things out, is if you forget the word, you might remember where that word appeared in the chart. And if you remember where it appeared, that might stimulate your memory of what that word is. Again, you're creating a backup connection to help you build back towards what say the definition of something is, or something that you're trying to remember.
Guess that means you could also, like, similar to the days of the week, I mean, you can also use numbers. Like, remember, starting one is Sunday, two, which I learned, for some reason my brain thinks of Monday being the first day of the week, which is actually how Spanish users lay it out. But I guess that's the 3rd connection, is I have numbers, color, and just the names of the days of the week.
Yep. Yeah, so the advantage of doing numbers is, you're thinking about something sequentially, right? So you're remembering this came first, then this came second, then this came third, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, you can kind of doing that might help you kind of, especially for people who are, they kind of like learning, or they have an easy time like visually imagining something, kind of trying to imagine where something is within space, that this comes first, then this comes second, then this comes third, can actually be a really useful technique for remembering something, kind of remembering physically in space where it is in your mind. All right. I may have fully saturated you at this point. These are really, really important. I mean, this is when you are trying to build a memory of something, when you're trying to study something for a test, what you want to do is not just practice the same thing over and over again. What you want to do is you want to build a network of connections around that memory. So if one connection fails, you have backup connections. If you remember that one simple principle, that is going to help you so much in studying. So in this coming week's lecture, we're going to learn about memory, just very generically. We're going to talk about the information processing theory. We're going to talk about the model, different models of memory. But in the back of your head, what I suggest you try to do is think about techniques for building these networks of memory. When we get to long-term memory, that's where a lot of that information is going to be. That's like the third lecture in the series. You're going to learn very deeply about how to build memory networks, how to build, it's called elaborative rehearsal, trying to make many different connections to what you are trying to learn. So look for that, think about that as you are viewing these lectures, and then try to adopt it in your own study habits. I assure you, if you spend some time trying to do this, it could very well make a huge difference, especially if you're someone who's not, you don't really like taking tests. Maybe you feel you don't have the best memory. Sometimes it's just a matter of knowing how to study. And once you figure that out, once you figure out how to build memories, how to make memories that are easy to recall, suddenly you find out you actually are pretty good. You actually do have a pretty good memory. It's just you needed to kind of figure out how to do that, how to make those memories. All right. Questions? Comments, concerns?
There's still nothing about Dr. Gottsman's psychology research yet, is there?
There is not. I have asked her. She has still not got it off the ground. Again, we'll see what happens. I will let you know when she does. And if she does not by a certain point, we may just say that that portion of the research participation will be dropped. But again, keep assuming that this will be made available to you within the next couple of weeks, hopefully. Yeah, I'll let you know.
Gotcha. And just by curiosity, what colors do you think of for the days of the week? Because I noticed you said 3 of those that I know you could pop in your head.
That's fun. So I did not learn the days of the week that way, but for some reason I have like an intuitive sense of what color things are. Yeah, Tuesday's yellow, Wednesday's green. I'm just gonna top of my head this. I'm not gonna think too deeply about it. Thursday is like brown. Friday is maybe like a maroon, like a reddish brown. Saturday is purple. Sunday is white.
That is weird because I think of Monday blue, Tuesday pink, Wednesday green, Thursday purple, Friday orange, Saturday dark blue, and Sunday like a pinkish red.
I don't know why I believe these are just associations I've probably built up in some really weird unconscious way. It was not an effort, I assure you.
That's absolute. That's just hearing that you organize the days of the week by color differently. Just like that blows me away for some reason.
I think that things tend to be kind of, I think when that happens, what that really means is that there's no like inherent color to the days of the week. I think it's really arbitrary. And so you just kind of like, you build these random connections in your mind where eventually a color seems to associate with a word. I think what's really cool is when people land on the same thing. Then that there's usually some logic behind it. So my guess is there's no logic to how colors associate with days of the week. However, I don't know. I'm trying to think of what things that people tend to coalesce on. They tend to agree on. I think when people agree and they aren't all, like, sharing the same culture, they're not sharing the same upbringing, they're not, using the same study techniques. I think that's the really cool stuff.
Yeah, that also makes me think about like where you would rank, because I can see like with days of the week and stuff like that, like that's just basic stuff, and then there's stuff where a lot of people are also involved in, like socially, like what's your favorite restaurant, and then this you're based off just the food, and you have the same favorite restaurant as somebody else. But
Right,
that
right.
that's interesting.
Off the food, or off the same Yelp review, right? Because
That's true
you
too.
all believe the 5-star ratings, and so that is also a
Yeah,
kind of authority bias, right? Is you assume that people who've taken the time to rate are not just trolls trying to drive business away from business or something.
yeah, that's that's just crazy to me. Thinking about this kind of stuff, because I like talking about psychology, especially this part of it. So
Yeah, memory is very interesting. All right, that's all I have for you. I was planning for this to be actually get over earlier, but I think we had a good conversation here. Uh, with the 3 minutes that you have left, remember that there are online studies that you have to do. Make sure that you do them. Those are available, even if the in-lab ones are not. Remember that you can complete extra studies beyond the required amount for extra credit. All right. If you have no other questions, I'll make sure to get your research proposals back to you ASAP. Otherwise, thank you very much for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Thanks, everybody.
thank you. Have a good one.
You too.